my name is Katelyn Cioffi, and I'm a research scholar at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law. And my paper today is going to look very much at an application of digital identity in public service delivery, specifically using the example of Social Security in the form of cash transfers. And what I want to talk about is the process through which digital identities and digital ID systems come to mediate the realization, particularly of economic and social rights. And this is building on a lot of work that has been done about, digital ideas, infrastructure, data justice, as well as, ongoing debates about the relationship between the citizenship and the state and the role that digital ID can play in that relationship. And my argument today is really that, digital IDs can substantively alter the way that the state approaches specific individual rights. And in doing so, they can shift the financial and non-financial burdens that individuals face in realizing their own rights within welfare systems. And for the presentation today, I'm drawing on a case study from some recent research that our project has been doing with two organizations in Uganda, the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights and Unwanted Witness. And this research is ongoing and has involved both a literature review, interviews with affected individuals, and also speaking to government officials and other external experts about the design and intent of the national digital ID system in Uganda. But just to note from the top, I think that there are a lot of parallels with this experience in other countries, particularly in the work that we've seen coming out of India and the integration of Aadhaar into the welfare state there, as well as in the United Kingdom and the experiences with universal credit and programs like Verify UK. So I don't think that I'll be able to address some of the more comparative issues, but I think this case study does have a lot of parallels with other areas in other countries. So if I could just have the first slide, please. Just to start with some framing, I'm approaching this from the perspective of a human rights practitioner and lawyer. So the underlying assumption of my work is that, human rights frameworks and principles are essential and often underutilized tools to help us understand the impact of digital ID systems and whether or not they can be trustworthy. And to put this in context, it's clear that digital ID systems have become a development imperative for many governments around the world. And there are a lot of critical questions that are being asked about the systems, their relationship to legal identity, citizenship, statelessness, belonging, and that forms a background for my work, but I won't really be able to touch on that too much today. But also to say that this is drawing on research from the fields of ICT for development, data justice, human rights, that really emphasizes the socio-technical and political repercussions of this broader transition to digital government. So that's another kind of contextual factor in the work that I want to present today. So the next slide, please. So the two key questions that I'm really asking is, how has the integration of a digital ID system altered the way that the state approaches and delivers specific public services? And as I said, I'll focus on Social Security payments because I think specificity is very important in these cases. Generally a lot of framework legislation will talk broadly about public services, but obviously each public service is quite different in the way that it functions and the way that it's administered. So I want to try and really embrace the kind of messiness of actually a specific right. And the kind of flip side of that is, how are digital ID systems changing rights and responsibilities within those services? And thinking about this very dynamically as a process of social inclusion. So, I'm really embracing this idea that social inclusion is not a sort of binary definition, but a process that is mediated and involves relational dynamics between individual actors within the state, and it has political, economic, social, cultural components that are all mediated by digital ID systems. So how has the system really affected that process of social inclusion over time? So the next slide, please. So I think to really just give this the specificity that I think would be helpful, I want to dive right into the case study, which is the national ID system in Uganda, which is sometimes called Ndagamuntu. And, like many countries, Uganda has a long history of documentary identification systems. But the current system really started to take shape around early 2000s. And is often the case, it was driven primarily by national security concerns, the need for regional integration through the East African community, and the need to sort of administer elections within the country. So there are a lot of political drivers behind the formation of the National Digital ID system. It's governed by a piece of legislation called the Registration of Persons Act of 2015. And just two kind of legal aspects of this that I would emphasize. First of all, the piece of legislation makes it mandatory to register with the digital ID system for all Ugandans. And it also is mandatory for use in the delivery of public services. And the system itself has a kind of what's become a familiar way of structuring a foundational ID system, and that there's a centralized database. They issue national ID cards, national ID numbers, and it's linked to a biometric and biographic information profile. And I think, what's important to recognize also is that while they've been quite successful in rolling out the system, there's still a sizable proportion of the adult population that does not have a national ID number or a national identity card. So next slide, please. And we can talk quite a long time about the difficulties with registration, but I want to go right to how it's been integrated with this specific program of social assistance. So the Senior Citizens Grant is a cash transfer program that's offered to people over 80 years of age. And what has happened over time is the national ID has been integrated into the delivery of this program in several ways. So first of all, the central database has become the point of information where you generate lists of eligible beneficiaries based on their age and their presence in the database. As well as the national ID card and the national ID number are used to biometrically enroll individuals in the program to set them up for bank accounts with the payment service provider, as well as to authenticate their identity on payment days. So this is a pretty intensive integration, despite the fact that there's widespread exclusion of older persons from the national identity database. So there's been a lot of issues with registering with MIRA, biometric failures due to fingerprints, as well as errors on the national ID database due to date of birth. So there are a lot of issues with this system that have created friction with the way that it's been integrated with Social Security. So if I could have the next slide, please. So to start with, how has the integration of the digital ID affected the delivery of Social Security? I think, first of all, the digital ID, beyond what it was originally imagined for and designed for, has now become a form of infrastructure that allows the state to see the citizen in a specific way. And I think there's been a lot of literature trying to develop, the concept of infrastructure and the way that it affects citizen-state relationship. And here we can see that playing out in that, it reduces the individuals to their database profile and makes contingent a lot of their rights on the details that have been provided in that database. The second thing that I think has changed significantly is that the institutional responsibilities for administering the right to Social Security have become increasingly fragmented because of the introduction of the digital ID. And this is really critical because the information that the program relies on to deliver the right has now been held by different actors, some of whom have different levels of control and visibility over the data. So there's a real transparency problem and a real accountability problem here. And from a human rights perspective, this is incredibly important because it holds back the ability to recognize and institutionalize the right, because it becomes unclear who the duty bearers are and what the sort of thresholds of their responsibilities are to individuals who are seeking to realize their right. And the third thing is that programmatic changes that have been required to accommodate the use of the digital ID have affected the political settlement. And what I mean by that is that I think the social contract behind the delivery of these payments has been affected by the introduction of the digital ID, partially because the means of targeting has become much more centralized and much more concentrated, and the authority to make determinations about the program has become removed from the local communities where it was originally located. So it has really changed the way that the social welfare system is viewed. It's no longer seen as something local, but now something that's much more centralized and much more dictated by powers that are sort of beyond the local community. So next slide, please. And thinking about the flip side, which is the second question, which is more about the lived experience of social inclusion and how the use of digital ID has affected that. I think, it's become clear that digital ID systems have the potential to sort of harden and exacerbate existing inequalities, to facilitate discrimination. And I think really what it's doing is increasing the contingency of rights. So it's increasing a lot of the sort of barriers and requirements to accessing rights, and adding in a lot of additional steps that need to be taken in order to realize those rights fully. And what's important about this, I think, is that it is often portrayed as a question of sort of inclusion versus exclusion. But I think when you look at the granular details of an integration like this, what you see is that what there actually is there's a transfer of burdens that fundamentally alters the way the right is realized beyond the question of exclusion. So what I mean by that is that individuals now have a lot more responsibility and bear a lot of economic, financial, non-financial burdens in their ability to realize the right. So some of the efficiency gains that have been gotten by government are merely being transferred to individuals, and it changes significantly the way that they experience the right and the way that they view it. It creates more of an adversarial relationship with the administrators of the right, and really changes fundamentally the way that the right is realized and recognized by the community. And also the fragmentation of accountability across different public and private institutions has made it really difficult to have accountability and transparency. And I think part of that is because of this increased burden on individuals to navigate the different pathways that digital ID has created in the realization of these rights. The sort of new structures that have been put in place without adequate legal frameworks to identify the responsibilities of duty bearers, and also the sheer technological issues of having a digital system in a country where the digital divide is still significant. Many beneficiaries live in rural areas that don't have good ICT connection. They don't have mobile phones. So it's really changed the pathways to accountability and the ability to redress grievances. Next slide, please. And I think just to sum up, because I think I'm running out of time, I think looking at these very specific case studies can help us to identify some of the broader issues of integrating the digital ID with public services. And I think the first thing that I would say is, there's a real importance to linking digital ID when it becomes an infrastructure to specific substantive rights, and to having legal frameworks and pathways of accountability that are specific to those rights, because often generic legislative frameworks of accountability aren't sufficient because they don't address the individual issues of administering, for instance, the right to Social Security or the right to health, which will require very different levels of trustworthiness, have different pathways of social inclusion and social exclusion that need to be taken into account. I think the discussions about intersectionality are really important here, because who are the groups being infected and what are their individual needs? And I think that there's a real need to be able to reflect some of that complexity. The second is that the exclusionary dynamics can slowly degrade trustworthiness of the system, and I think that's apparent to many. But what I would say also is that we do tend to see exclusion as a kind of binary, but what's really important is the friction and the dynamic of exclusion that can happen across the life cycle of a program. So it's not just about the registration process, it's about additional barriers that are put in place at every step along the way, and that really transform the relationship between the individual and the state. And the third and final point that I would want to make is, there are clearly ways in which the use of a digital ID system is actually being used as a retrenchment of the welfare state under the guise of a kind of reformative and digitalization agenda. And I think you can see that in programs like the Senior Citizens Grant, where the use of digital ID enables the government to both reduce the number of staff that are available to individuals, which is something that happened, to move authority away from the community and towards a centralized sort of different form of authority, and the way that it devolves the burden and the cost of administering the state to individuals. And I think we can see this as a sort of a deeply political move that needs to be kind of revealed and grappled with when looking at the way that these digital systems are applied to public services. So that's it for me. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's it's a very important area, and there are several points being made in the comments, which could be turned into a question. But essentially, there seem to be an affinity between experts who is effectively selling identity management systems to governments, and governments that want to prioritize an identity management system over simply delivering something like welfare. So they've had a previous system which presumably did deliver welfare to people, and they then are sold an ID system which reduces the number of people they deliver welfare to. And this is so there's a multiple stakeholder problem. It's not just the government. The government is susceptible to lobbyists and so on. And I think one of my colleagues makes the point that you could ask the question, how many social policies could be delivered affordably without any national ID infrastructure whatsoever, since some of them have been in the past. Certainly social welfare in the UK was delivered without any internet or mobile phones, so it must have worked. So why are people thinking they need these other things? I think your point is that there's politics in it. Is very well made. I'm trying to see if I can turn that into an actual question though. And obviously in parts of the world where there's even less infrastructure available for the sort of digital side of it, then it seems like the meeting place between these people trying to sell a new infrastructure and the government, where the government's job of delivering some service is in a non-exclusive way is undermined by that and sort of deprioritized by that, which is very weird.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think the infrastructure takes on a life of its own over time, even beyond the original sort of salesman who put it in place. But after a while, it becomes about servicing the infrastructure. And you've definitely seen this in Uganda and in other places, where the need to develop an identity system has led the government to try and essentially coerce people to sign up. And they often do that through social rights. And it is typically targeted at those who are most vulnerable and historically excluded. But it's because the infrastructure needs to be serviced and has become a policy priority of its own, rather than being seen as a mechanism of improving service delivery. So you really get that kind of flip side of the policy priorities.
Great. Okay, there's also several people have put in links, a couple of links to some useful references. There's a Routledge book on identification citizenship in Africa, and then there's another reference to a paper from Uganda, I think. So people can look at those in the comments. Great. I think we're out of time, but thanks so much for a really great talk.